months away, thanks to the University of Haifa and to Vatat for funding this research project, and to Columbia University Archive, where I consulted the Harris Oliphant papers. Thanks also to maybe Ida for giving an excellent introduction to Laurence Oliphant, which now means that my paper is somewhat shorter. I'm going to try to focus on things that Ida didn't cover. I'm going to be looking in more detail at some of Laurence and Alice Oliphant's quite unusual ideas concerning the Sympneumata, or the divine counterpart. So what I'm really looking at today, I would say, is the intersection of a Western esoteric symbol, the symbol of the divine androgyne, and the woman question in the sexual mysticism of Alice and Laurence Oliphant, as presented in this 1885 work, Sympneumata. How do you do this? Yeah. Okay. So to clarify, when I refer to Western esotericism, I'm referring to it in the sense that Wouter mentioned earlier, the sense coined by Antoine Fevre, meaning a family of European traditions that share certain characteristics. And when I refer to occultism, I'm referring specifically to 19th century developments within the history of Western esotericism. Now, the Fevrian characteristic of transmutation, I'm going to assume a certain amount of familiarity on your part. I don't have time to go into all the different Fevrian characteristics of Western esotericism, but the one that's most important to Sympneumata is the concept of transmutation. The other five that Fevre speaks about are not really prominent in Sympneumata, but nonetheless, I argue that this is an occult work, and it's indebted to numerous Western esoteric traditions, the most prominent of which is Swedenborgianism, and I'll be going into that later. The word Sympneumata is Greek. It's a neologism that the Oliphants coined, pneumata referring to souls, and symp denoting togetherness, and it indicates the central theory of the work, that is that we all have a counterpart of the opposite gender, that it is either an embodied human being or it's a spiritual counterpart that we contact internally. The book was dictated to Laurence by his wife, Alice, but he claimed that he agreed with all of the ideas contained therein. So I consider it really to be by both of them, especially since Alice learnt most of what she knew about the Sympneumata from Laurence. So a little bit more detail about what the book is teaching. Its central premise is that the restoration of the original ethereal and androgynous nature of humanity will occur through each individual's contact with their own sympneuma, or counterpart. So in this original androgynous human being, the vitality of God flowed from the inner being into emotional, mental, and physical systems that were built around this spiritual, ethereal being. But then a tragedy occurred, and the natural flow of energy that would have carried this androgynous humanity into adulthood, where it would have reproduced in divine conditions without passion or self-consciousness, was arrested. And what was it that arrested it? Well, it occurred because of the female part of the androgyne's desire for bestial sexual intercourse, which she witnessed amongst the animals. So whereas once this had occurred, the divine androgen split in two. And whereas the divine current had previously flowed freely, what the Oliphants describe as bestial forces now operate inwards from the outside, and they come into conflict with the currents that operate from the inside out. And the result of this is that human bodies now experience confusion and frustration and all sorts of negative emotions, and they don't know really what they want. And this could be more Laurence Oliphant's description of his own mental workings. What they also say is that material bodies came into being in order to protect the inner ethereal core of each human. And in addition to that, sexual intercourse now came into being. So one of the main messages of the book is that sex is bad and it needs to be abandoned in favour of a relationship with the Sympneumata, the counterpart. This is what they said about sexual intercourse. So despite the fall, bisexual cells continue to exist beneath the surface of every human being and could be awakened by forsaking sex in favour of this relationship with the Sympneumata. So, in addition to the restoration of the androgynous unity and the redemption of humanity, this relationship would also give one enhanced senses, enhanced sensations. And this seems to be to do with the practices that Isaac mentioned, the breathing together, because these ideas are really very intimately linked with spiritual practices that the Oliphants participated in the Thomas Lake Harris Brotherhood of the New Life. Crucially, women were called to be at the forefront of the restoration process, which was looking forwards towards a new phase of evolution, leading to the transmutation and ultimately the restoration of bisexuality. So here's Laurence Oliphant, who I won't say too much about now, but he was brought up a devout evangelical, and he travelled the world. He wrote lots of popular books and articles. He pursued a career in law, and he became a member of Parliament in his mid-30s. He was a bit of a Victorian celebrity. Everyone had heard of him. He was very charming, he was witty, he was popular with the ladies, and he had lots of rich, famous, and aristocratic friends who were all utterly bewildered when he decided to drop it all and go and live with Thomas Lake Harris in America. According to Laurence himself, he had a desire to be humbled, some might say humiliated. This is the man himself, Thomas Lake Harris, that Oliphant met in 1859 when he was about 30, before he became a member of Parliament actually. And he was under this man's influence for 17 years of his life, more or less. And Harris had a very powerful influence over Laurence and indeed over Alice. He was charismatic, he was powerful, and he demanded total obedience. And he made Laurence perform all sorts of menial and humiliating tasks like sewing petticoats. So it's very difficult to imagine the great, famous member of Parliament, Laurence Oliphant, sat sewing petticoats. So Harris taught the doctrine of counterparts, as well as the notion that God is male as well as female, and that Christ has a female counterpart, Christa. And Harris himself claimed to have his, Jesus Yesser as well as the other one. Just a different name for the same thing. Harris claimed to have his own counterpart, who we heard about, the Lily Queen. He came into contact with his counterpart after his wife died. There's been some speculation that that might have been an influence, but nobody really knows. In 1857, Harris received word from heaven that he was the pivotal man, or the prophet on whom human salvation depended. And Oliphant joined Harris's community in 1867, about 10 years after Harris received this revelation. And as we heard, it was situated in America at a place called Brockton, near Lake Erie in New York State. And it later moved to Fountain Grove, Santa Rosa, California. So I think it's important to see this brotherhood of the new life within the context of the Christian revival known as the Second Great Awakening, which swept America from the 1820s and which led to an enormous proliferation of different Protestant denominations, as well as the growth of these denominations, and also a popularization of millenarian beliefs. And the American Protestants fell broadly into two categories: the Reformers, which included the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and the Anglicans, and the Radicals, which included the Anabaptists and the Spirituals. And I think it's with the Radicals that they were the most important influence on, or one of the most important Christian influences on Thomas Lake Harris. They tended to announce doctrines of the restoration of a pure apostolic church, They emphasize free will, universal salvation, human powers of prophecy, very importantly, and an impending new millennium or dispensation, also very important to Harris. As we know, the burned-over district of upstate New York from the 1840s and 50s was also the home to a number of unusual religious movements, most famous of which was spiritualism from 1848, but also various communities practicing forms of sexual mysticism. I just wanted to mention one or two of those just to give a bit of context. Some of these groups practiced what we call free love, but others practiced celibacy. For example, the Shakers, a branch of Quakers who arrived from England in 1774, led by a prophetess, Mother Ann Lee. And several Shakers were known to have joined Harris's community. Another community with similarities to Harris's Brotherhood was Ephrata, established in 1732 by Conrad Beissel, which was influenced by pietist, hermetic, mystical, and Bermanist currents. And they also believed in a sexually androgynous God, and that after the fall, humanity divided into male and female, and that these could be reunited. The community practiced celibacy, monastic discipline, physical labor, and rituals. So you can see that Harris's community was not unprecedented. It exists within that certain historical context. So moving now to Alice, whom Laurence Oliphant thought was, to his taste, very beautiful. You can see the photo in the photo here that she was indeed. She was also very popular and considered to be very talented. And amazingly, she was prepared to accept Laurence's bizarre religion, so lucky him. She was dissatisfied with the forms of religion that she'd come into contact with the two, and she wanted a practical outlet for her devotion, so she got in touch with Thomas Lake Harris and pledged her allegiance to him. And Laurence and Alice married in 1872. According to Laurence, they enjoyed, I don't know if enjoyed is the right word, but they had a celibate marriage. So it looks like Laurence initially believed that Alice was his counterpart, but by 1878 he'd given up on that idea and come to have a relationship with a counterpart that was on the other side, as he said. But after Alice's tragic death in 1886, Laurence concluded that Alice had in fact been his counterpart, and he was now receiving information from her and dictating books from her in the spirit world. So as we've heard, in 1881, Laurence and Harris split. Laurence claimed that Harris had allowed selfish and base currents to pollute him and that he'd become perverted. Laurence also challenged Harris's spiritual authority. He claimed to have prophetic revelations of his own. And by the end of 1878, Laurence had developed his project aimed at persuading the Ottoman government to grant him a 25-year concession for the settlement of Jews in Palestine. This is where they lived in Haifa. They moved there in 1882, German temple colony. This is their house in Dahlia, their summer house, where they were very popular with the local Jews community. And there they lived out their religion, and they hoped to prepare the way for the reception of the doctrine of counterparts. And Sympneumata was published in 1885, and Alice died a year later of a fever, tragically. So that's where we'll leave their story now. I wanted to just briefly mention a couple of points about the intellectual history of the Western esoteric symbol of the divine androgen. I found the work of the historian of Mormonism, John L. Brooke, to be quite interesting, and it gives us an indication of how Western esoteric currents reached Thomas Lake Harris. Since Harris's ideas actually have something in common with Mormonism, Mormonism also teaches a doctrine of a dual gender divinity and celestial marriage. Brooke traced the transmission of Hermetic traditions from early modern Europe to colonial America through Quakerism, the Ephrata community that I mentioned, Freemasonry, folk Hermeticism, and Swedenborgianism and treasure hunting traditions. best friends. And one of the earlier mentions of the symbol is a famous passage in Plato's Symposium, which states that humans descended from a race of hermaphrodites, which divided into two sexes and which now seek to regain their unity. The androgyne appears again in Hermetic traditions, which very generally sought to recover divine power and perfection possessed by Adam before the fall. In alchemy, Hermetic traditions were also related to, they were allegorized as the mating, fusion, death and resurrection of the alchemical king and queen, leading to a divine androgynous Adam. There's been a very interesting article in a recent book. What was that the name of that guy that wrote that article about about the very chemical side of how these images relate to specific chemical. Yeah.
In the course.
Right. Exactly. I thought that was great. Very interesting. Anyway, the image is there, and this is from an alchemical text from the 18th century. That's at Glasgow University. Very briefly, Kabbalistic traditions also contain related ideas. Sympneumata mentioned this specifically, and its interpretation of the Kabbalistic understanding was that God, like every soul, is androgynous in its original state, but splits into two in its approach to the earth, and the two parts are reunited through marriage or through death. The Christian theosopher Jacob Boehmer postulated a divine androgynous Adam that split after the fall. He also spoke about dialectical interactions between opposites leading towards perfection, and a female aspect of the Godhead, the Virgin Sophia. Boehmer influenced the Swedish visionary Emanuel Swedenborg, who believed in celestial marriage to one's true spouse in heaven. And Swedenborg's visions of love in the heavenly realm were a very important influence on Harris, who had been a minister of the Swedenborgian Church of the New Jerusalem, and who came to see himself as Swedenborg's successor. And Sympneumata also speaks about Swedenborg briefly and says that he teaches the doctrine of counterparts. So Swedenborgian and theosophical ideas found their way into spiritualism, in which the concept of affinity proposed that male and female halves of one soul seek to reunite in this world so that they can achieve unity and return to their divine origin. And an example of that can be found in Emma Hardinge Britton's Ghostland. These Swedenborgian and spiritualist ideas influenced a common 19th century idealization of love, that men and women have complementary natures and fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. We don't got some water. I'm throwing it first. Okay. Okay, it's fine. So, as a self-consciously transitional period, the 19th century witnessed intense debates and anxiety surrounding the nature and role of women, marriage, and love. And the Victorian women's movement emerged in the 1850s. And it's been very well established that occultism and spiritualism provided an important site for discussion of gender roles. So Sympneumata responded to contemporary gender anxiety, I argue, by employing a reading of a Western esoteric symbol of the divine androgyne in its answer to the woman question. Oops. I'll just read it. This is what Sympneumata says. It says, "The question of woman was never asked until modern times, and it's hardly asked before it's answered. The ghastly results in hearts and homes of the women's rights movement are barely established before the true nature of the instinct from which it sprang begins to unfold its beauty and the peace of its sweet power. The recovery by woman of her real marriage state will now excuse, correct, emancipate, and transfigure her. And this quotation, I think, encapsulates Sympneumata's perspective on women, which I'd like to now contextualize a bit more. So according to Sympneumata, unspecified recent changes have brought forth the long-buried reserve of universal femininity, without which human life can't be complete. Prior to this change, women were completely useless. After the division of the androgyne, men somehow managed to retain their masculine nature due to the nature of masculine energy, as it were, masculine forces. But without man as a transmitting medium for her radiations, argues Sympneumata, woman was completely useless, and this is why women don't appear in the pages of history. So in light of this recent change, evidenced by the growth of the women's movement, women are called to lead the way in the rejection of currents of brute passion in favour of divine love, that is, to reject sex in favour of relationship with the counterpart. So in fact, one of the chapters of Sympneumata is entitled The Call to Woman, and women are summoned to make the most of their newfound agency, to participate in social growth, the advancement of spiritual and physical evolution, and to lead the way in the restoration of humanity. So this kind of narrative is not without, there are also other similar narratives, and these are just some of the examples of a few books that I came across that have similar calls to women. For example, Sarah Ellis's work. My sisters, she wrote, you have deep responsibilities, you have urgent claims, a nation's moral wealth is in your keeping. She also spoke about women's social obligation, responsibility, etc. So in this one by Margaret Fuller, it has a more kind of spiritual dimension than Sarah Ellis's work. She argued for women's spiritual dignity, and that although women were more capable of channeling electricity and magnetism than men, unfortunately those currents had not yet been brought out in women at any period throughout history, and now was the time for women to become aware of their feminine power. But the Sympneumatic woman, I argue, is very special indeed. She's literally a new kind of woman. She's empowered, she's strident, she's educated, she's responsible, she's active, she's emancipated, and she is transfigured. So I would like to argue that she's an example of a late modern literary topos of the new woman. The term new woman was extrapolated in 1894 from an article by British feminist writer Sarah Grand entitled The New Aspect of the Woman Question. But despite only being named in 1894, the new woman had her heyday throughout the 80s and the 90s, and as you recall, Sympneumata was published in 1885. The new woman was depicted variously as a social reformer, feminist, as an activist, as a socialist, as a writer, and later as a suffragette. And she was as much a literary construct as she was a real woman. So what I think we have here in Sympneumata is just such a construct, albeit a very idiosyncratic one, I admit, that's based on the notion of the restoration of the divine androgen. Here we go, that's the quote that I was missing before. Fine. So despite their valorization of female power, the Oliphants believed, as we've seen, that the women's movement had failed and was in danger of unriveting the very fabric of society. This fear of the unriveting of society is a very Victorian fear, and one that was associated with fears regarding the figure of the new woman, that she was a threat to the human race, a threat to the institution of marriage, that she was sexually deviant and licentious. So I argue that as well as presenting this new woman, the Oliphants try to reassure the reader that the new woman would not be any of these terrible things. Thus the Sympneumatic new woman was presented not as a threat, but as the saviour of the human race. Not a sexually licentious, but a celibate. But despite her celibacy, she will uphold the institution of marriage. Furthermore, although the feminine principle was valorized, the sympneumatic woman was sufficiently humble to acknowledge her part in the fall, and the fall and the splitting of the divine androgyne, and the fact that she could never be independent of man also, since the universe needs male and female energy combined in bisexual unity. So, as such, the figure of the new woman in Sympneumata is a quintessentially late modern type, and these reassurances are very Victorian. So, in summary, I want to say that Sympneumata employed an idiosyncratic reading of the esoteric symbol of the divine androgen to depict the sympneumatic new woman. That the Oliphants assured the reader that although empowered and celibate, the sympneumatic new woman was not a threat to marriage or society. And this is how the Oliphants utilized a reading of a Western esoteric symbol to respond to some of the most pressing needs and anxieties of their age.